Chapter 8 The Revolution Introduction.
In this lecture, you take the plunge with the trembling colonists into the uncertain maelstrom of their war for independence. To say that the outcome of the entire adventure was uncertain until the very end was, at the time, itself too uncertain to say. Every day for 6 years came a new shock somewhere, a new disaster or a victory, reason to hope or reason to despair. You will follow the colonists' final attempts at compromise to avoid the conflict of arms, even after the bloody sacrifices the British suffered after Lexington and Concord, and their Pyrrhic victory at Bunker Hill, which the rebels hoped would convince the king to come back to the negotiating table. Later you will stand with the rebels at the Paris Peace Conference, as they hammered out the best deal they could wring from an adversary whose insulting condescension was made even more acute by the humiliations of defeat. And finally you will embark with the colonists, transformed now from British subjects to American citizens, as they launched their new ship of state into the uncharted waters of nation-making, guided in a practical sense by the skills of cooperation they had learned during the war, but still a failure as their fragile boat was quickly swamped by storms of conflict and disunity in spite of their best efforts. Their first attempt at creating a United States of America was an almost complete disaster, so much so that both the British, their late adversaries, and the French, their late allies, whose interests the Americans had not honored in the peace treaty that ended the war, were both salivating for a rematch, to get back into the fray and grab North America as soon as the silly American experiment in self-government crashed in on itself and dissolved into the chaos that every European monarch knew must be its inevitable fate. For history had not recorded in those days a single instance of a democratic form of government surviving even on a small scale, even among the ancient Greeks, who had tried it for just a few cities. And the brash Americans were trying to do it for an entire continent. Ridiculous. The British and the French looked on with a mixture of contempt and undisguised avarice as the Americans' childish experiment floundered and, like wolves anticipating that their prey would tire and weaken, waited patiently to move in for the kill, even if they had to fight each other again over the spoils. But you will be there also to see their worst intentions confounded. You will, in the process, also become acquainted with the rebel American leaders, who, like all skilled politicians, styled themselves patriots from the outset. You will learn more about George Washington than you thought was important to know. But there is a reason he's called the father of his country. One of the reasons is that, like all fathers, he made mistakes, sometimes very big mistakes, but he was always able to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Washington was the ultimate competitor, but he also was always the consummate Southern gentleman at the same time, able to avoid flaunting his bigger-than-life ambitions while making clear his conviction that he was as good as it gets, no matter what he did, mistakes and all. Nobody ever accused Washington of modesty, deserved or not, but nobody ever accused him of arrogance either. He apparently knew himself very well, except for a knowledge of his limitations, which he learned as he went along, quickly mastering his deficiencies and learning from his failures. He always wanted the top job, whatever the job was. General of the armies, president of the country, though he had to be persuaded to take that particular job because the war had so worn him out. Before then, he was the wealthiest aristocrat in Virginia. He was the best dancer, the best horseman, the best at everything. Washington didn't just hate coming in second or not being top dog. He loved winning, and the bigger the odds against him, the more he relished the ultimate victory, which he always assumed would be his sooner or later. When the British generals had him on the ropes and were so sure he was licked that they didn't even bother to follow his beat-up soldiers to corner his army and finish it off, and this did happen several times, Washington just considered the defeat a dress rehearsal for the main show. He would come back next day and surprise them all, time after time. The British never learned that you couldn't win against Washington by just knocking him down. You had to knock him out, which they never succeeded in doing. And speaking of that, You will learn a lot about battle tactics in this lecture, too, and you'll also learn about the public relations and propaganda war that the rebels put together. You will meet the indefatigable and irresistible Thomas Paine and hear some of his persuasive rhetoric. You will be there when Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, with a little help from his friends. And you will note the success of the pamphlet war and the committees of correspondence, whose job it was to run an underground rebel communication system. On the British side, you will follow the evolution of their military strategy as they try one idea after another to bring the tenacious rebels to heel. You will follow their traditional city strategy as they successfully captured rebel strongholds, only to find to their amazement and chagrin that the revolution was not actually in the cities anyway, where many British loyalists lived, but in the country. Then you'll watch them try a divide-and-conquer strategy, cutting the colonies in half to make subduing the countryside more manageable. That might actually have worked, by the way, given enough time. You'll discover why it didn't. After that, you'll see them take the war down south, where they thought they had a lot of loyalist friends who would help them round up the rebels in that region. They thought they could subdue that area quite quickly, then move north again. That didn't work either. You will learn why. Meantime, while the British were casting about for a winning military strategy, the Americans were at work in Europe, trying to persuade the French to come in on their side. If you know anything about the French in this time period, you might be asking why the American rebels bothered to appeal to them. The French government was an oppressive, authoritarian dictatorship. The French people would, in fact, ignite their own revolution to throw off the despotic rule of their king, Louis XIV, and chop off his head, only a few years after the American Revolution had concluded. Why would the liberty-loving American rebels even be talking to the French king and his ministers? And why would the French king be talking to them? They were fighting at home for principles which would be his downfall if the French people or the French Parliament ever took the Americans as seriously. You will find out why the king listened anyway, and listened very intently. Liberty sometimes has some strange bedfellows. And you will also examine in this lecture the wider world of British foreign policy that King George and his ministers and Parliament had to deal with during the American Revolution. They had a lot more on their plate than just putting down the rebellious colonists in America, and you will discover how their overcrowded calendar and their overextended empire helped the Americans win in the end. You will also learn the several ways that the American rebels were themselves divided, why they couldn't always agree on aims and strategies. Their leaders were type A competitive personalities, so you would expect disagreement among them. That's true. There were even a few plots among Washington's generals to replace him as head of the army. People would call for his head every time he suffered a disastrous defeat. Then he would silence them with a daring victory next time out. But was there ever treason among the Patriot leaders? Yes, there was. You will learn about the treacherous disaffection of Benedict Arnold, one of Washington's most brilliant and successful generals. But the treason of one general could not slow down the freight train of the Revolution, which was up to full speed by then, even in the American West, the boundaries of which in those days were roughly the 1,000,000 or so square miles of the sprawling Ohio River basin and its many tributaries, an unimaginably huge expanse of rich farmland, lush mountain meadows, and towering primeval forests which had never known the stroke of the white man's axe. The Indians, however, had lived there since time out of mind, and the British took care to bring them into their tent as allies. With this strategy, they would still have a strong foothold west of the Allegheny and Appalachian Mountains, even if they lost their 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard. You will learn how well this apparently well-conceived idea worked out for them. But what, you must be asking, about the war at sea? There the Royal Navy had ruled supreme since Queen Elizabeth's hardy tars and lusty sea-dog adventurers had humiliated the Spanish Armada in 1588. Right? Well, almost right. The Royal Navy was omnipotent, all right, but they could be omnipotent in only a few places at a time, and they had a job to do that was sometimes even bigger than they were, because they had to defend a worldwide empire. Plus, the American rebels thought they knew a way to turn the big-gunned strength of the Royal Navy's battleships into a weakness. They hatched a bold plan to hit them where they thought they might be vulnerable. How well did that work? You will learn all about it. And finally, there was the issue of the peace treaty at the end of the war, when the time finally came. The question of what the rebels and ex-colonists, who now called themselves patriots and Americans, should demand from the British if and when the happy day finally arrived when His Majesty would be forced to acknowledge that further attempts to control and subdue the rebels, whom His Majesty never called patriots or Americans, were fruitless, or too expensive for the British taxpayer to agree to keep paying for, or both. This issue wasn't as simple as it might seem, by the way, because the fact was, as you will discover, that George Washington and his helpful ally, the French Marquis de Lafayette, blessed with a chance moment of good fortune, when they hemmed in British General Charles Cornwallis' army at Yorktown, Virginia, as he waited to be reinforced and replenished by the Royal Navy, were able to compel Cornwallis' surrender only by the lucky arrival of a squadron of the French fleet, which sailed up to Virginia from its duty station in the Caribbean Sea, and thereby prevented the Royal Navy from rescuing Cornwallis' army or resupplying it so Cornwallis could get back in the fight. Without Lafayette and the French Navy, the British could have kept the war going, and at the peace table later on, the British were sure that the Americans could not have won the war by themselves. Then, when the American negotiators stiffed the French in the peace treaty, the British knew that the French would not help the Americans again, which meant that they could have another go at getting their colonies back at the next opportunity if they struck soon enough. The brash Americans, they were sure, would be naked, vulnerable, and defenseless against them. Fortunately for the infant United States of America, they waited 30 years, till 1812, to give it another try, by which time the Americans had got their act together. But in 1783, at the peace table, King George III intended to drive a hard bargain. How did that intention turn out for him? And why was he compelled to accept the terms finally agreed on? You will learn the inside story of the Peace of Paris, which launched the United States onto the turbulent sea of the Community of Nations, the membership of which was at that time almost entirely a network of family-related monarchies. But wait, we're not done yet. This lecture would not be complete without an account of the most daunting challenge of all for the infant United States, that of establishing a nation based upon the principles for which they had fought the war. Why was this the most daunting challenge? Because it's one thing to plan military strategy that can win a war. The objects are merely to survive and to inflict enough damage on the enemy to persuade him to give up. People on your side who don't go along with your plan can be marginalized or ignored, and everybody understands that orders are orders and sacrifice is the order of the day. It is quite another thing to plan the organization of a civilian government after a war, especially trying to plan a democracy on a republican plan, where everybody now gets to have their say. Nothing gets done without compromise, and you can't just push people aside who disagree with the leader's strategy or the majority opinion. So what plan of government did the victorious rebels, now miraculously translated into liberty-loving patriots, try first? In this lecture you will learn all about it. And you will learn as well why it became as much a learning experience for them as it is for you. And what plan did they try next? How did that come about, after they awoke from the heady honeymoon they were enjoying with their ecstasy-drenched bride of liberty, and realized that they really had said, "I do," for better and for worse, for richer and for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do us part? They had to learn that marrying together the elements of a diverse society to make a country was a lot like marrying another person, except harder, because more than two people are involved, and because if the citizens of your country get a divorce later, the spat you have is not just a family feud, but a civil war, as everybody learned less than 100 years later when the southern states tried to divorce themselves from the northern states over a dispute in the marriage contract about slavery. Still, in 1787, The Founding Fathers, as we have known them ever since, wrote a heck of a Constitution, and they made the case then that if they didn't allow slavery, there would have been no marriage at all, no United States, because the Southern states would not have joined the Union, and they would have turned down the Northern states' proposal of marriage. The British and the French could have quickly returned, putting aside their ancient rivalries, to overpower the divided Americans and divide the continent between them. That was a great fear among the Founding Fathers, who hoped to outlaw slavery within the new Union by the voice of the people, through legislation, for they knew even then that the foul institution was fading because it was no longer profitable, even in the South. It's just that the Southerners had nothing else to replace slavery with, nobody else to do their labor. Then an accident of technological history changed all that and gave slavery a new lease on life, as you will learn in future lectures. That was not foreseen by the Founding Fathers when they made their concession to slavery. In fact, many of them lived long enough to see the institution outlawed in the next big group of territories which would be added to the Union and made into states. The fact was that the principles outlined in the Constitution have been the country's dependable guiding light, albeit with many conflicting interpretations of how to implement those principles, for 220 years. This lecture introduces you to the story of how Americans tried to implement those principles to provide the most ample scope possible for a democracy to work on a Republican plan of government on a national scale.